No one remembered her name when the search began. In the hush of the palace kitchens and the crowded alleys beyond the city gates, she was only a face in the crowd, a quiet girl with careful hands and a steady step. And yet the hand that would lift a crown had to come from somewhere, and kings take what the world discards. Esther moved like a shadow through the courts of Susa, her presence small and deliberate, as if she were a secret the palace kept for itself. She had arrived in Babylon's orbit like so many others, uprooted, placed, renamed. Had anyone asked the child who once ran through Jerusalem's lanes what her future should be, she would have laughed and named deserts and orchards, not golden thrones. But fate is not a mercy. It is a sift that winnows the grain from the chaff. And when the search for beauty and comportment began, when maidens were brought to the harem to be readied for a king's pleasure, it was Esther who moved forward, measured and quiet. Her hair was not braided with jewels. Her robe was not embroidered with foreign thread. There was nothing showy about her at all. Yet there was a steady dignity in the tilt of her chin that refused to be claimed by despair. Inside the palace, everything whispered of power. Long corridors of polished stone drank the sun and fed the rooms with a golden glow. Curtains of purple hung heavy, and perfumes clung to the air like remembered prayers. Servants moved with the knowledge that a single misstep could topple a life. Outside, the gardens were manicured into geometries of control. Inside, the courtiers smiled like masks that never came off. King Ahasuerus, Nebuchadnezzar's distant cousin in splendor, if not in spirit, ruled from a throne that glittered the way a desert mirage glitters, beautiful, impossible, and frightening when approached too close. He loved display. He loved the tilt of a head and the show of a hand. He loved power so loudly that the whole court learned to applaud it before it was even spoken. Esther learned the rhythm of the palace like a second language. She learned which doors were safer left unopened, and which men smiled with knives behind their lips. She learned to keep her eyes steady when the musicians struck up fanfares and the nobles drank from cups that tasted of silver and secrets. When the day came that she was chosen, nobody expected the quiet girl from the kitchens to step forward. The choosing felt like a storm launched by the king's whim, and Esther, like a leaf, found herself caught in its swirl. Her new name, given to her so she might be molded to a new identity, felt like a garment she had to learn to wear. She let people call her by that name, and she held her grief for the past like a private book. There is a strange kind of training that happens in places that hide power. Esther was trained to be beautiful for a court that measured worth by the way a woman filled a room. But beauty in that place was not only skin deep, it was performance, cunning, and an unbroken stillness in the face of 1,000 eyes. She practiced the slow turn of the head, the softened laugh, the patient tilt of the hand. She made her silence a skill, and silence here could be a shield. When Mordecai, her cousin and guardian, sat in the gate, he watched more than the comings and goings of the city. He watched the undercurrent. Mordecai was a man of quiet wisdom and iron grief, his face folded by exile, but his eyes steady with memory of a city torn and promises waiting to be kept. He had taught Esther to read the old words, to keep the scroll of memory close, and to fold prayer into the work of living. From the gate, he saw the girl that would become the queen, walking in measured steps toward the palace. He saw the way the sun caught the line of her cheek, and he suspected that the hand of God, which sometimes moves like a wind across a field, had a purpose no one could have guessed. He did not instruct heads of state. He did not stand in councils. He exercised influence in small corners, a timely warning, a withheld gossip, a careful refusal to trade truth for comfort. He kept the flame of identity alive in Esther, a lamp that would not go out. The court ceremony that crowned Esther was a study in calculated excess. Silks folded into mountains, perfumes pooled like slow rivers, and the king's laughter tasted of thunder. The women of the harem were arrayed to please, to perform, to yield. They moved like waves of polished shells around the central rock of the palace's will. When Esther stood before the king, the world seemed to pause on its breath.
Her heartbeat was loud enough for her to feel it in her throat, but her face was the face of a person who had learned to fold storm into prayer. 1,000 courtiers blinked and pretended their interest was casual. Yet in that room, in that single breath, everything changed. The current swum into a new channel, and a girl who once kept silence now held the gaze of a monarch. Esther's coronation was not merely a crown, it was a quiet rebellion. She had not sought position. She had received it like a servant receives dawn, unavoidable and full of work. To be chosen was to be exposed. It was to stand under a lens of expectation so bright that every flaw might be seen and exploited. But it also meant that a voice from a broken people had been placed at a vantage point where a whisper could become a decree. Power is dangerous for those who wear it without wisdom, but it is infinitely more dangerous for those whose hands shake under the jewel of responsibility and yet carry it with a heart that remembers a burnt city. Esther did not forget where she came from. She wrapped the memory of Jerusalem around her like a hidden scarf. In the weeks that followed, the palace became a theater of hazards. Banquets were rehearsed storms of allegiances, courtiers flattered with sharp tongues and softer knives. There were men who traded human fates like coins, and there were women who knew how to make the king proud and how to repair his boredom. Esther walked those rooms like a cat walking the edge of a high wall, careful, poised, and tense. And then there was Haman. If Mordecai was a watchful guardian in the gate, Haman was the whisper in the ear of power. He wore influence like a second skin, polished, smooth, and poisonous. He was a man who delighted in ceremony and in the sight of others lifting their eyes to his steps. It is the peculiar cruelty of history that men like Haman can rise by flattering the worst parts of a ruler. He bowed before the king and expected bows to be returned. When one man, Mordecai, refused to bow, it was not a small refusal. It was a stone thrown into a calm pond. The ripples would become a current. Haman's anger was not a bright flash. It was a slow and patient hunger. He nursed his pride and fed it with plans. If Mordecai would not bow, then Haman reasoned, perhaps Mordecai's people could be made to bow by fear. So he walked the palace halls and sharpened a decree like a blade, a law meant to remove an entire people in one stroke, a ceremonial stroke that masqueraded as order. When the decree landed like a shadow across the land, the court rejoiced with racked hands and secret contracts cashed. To the people, it meant a day of terror dressed in legalese, a time set for destruction, for names to be erased like charcoal on parchment. For the exiles and for Mordecai, it meant a line drawn under hope. For Esther, It meant a silence burdened with decisions she had never been trained to make. Mordecai carried the news to Esther like a thunderclap in a quiet room. He told her of the decree and of the date stamped upon it. He told her, too, of Haman's triumphal stride and how the king had signed on a whim and not recalled the moral stones beneath the throne. Esther's hands went cold. She folded the news into her chest like a garment that no seam could hold. And then Mordecai said the words that would split her between two lives. "Do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews." Those words landed and did not move. They had the weight of reality. Esther sat in the silence like a woman before a closed door. The palace buzzed in the background. Men who did not know the names of those whose lives they might end. She could feel the city of her memory like a drumbeat beneath her ribs. In the seam of that grief, a strange calm gathered. It is in the quiet that courage grows. It is in the dark that the seeds of audacity take root. Esther had been taught to be prudent. Now she learned that prudence without courage is a lesson in cowardice. She sent for the women's chamber and dressed not in the silks the court expected for a plea, but in a robe of plain color that said, without speech, "I am not for show." Her hands trembled when she wrote to Mordecai and asked him to assemble the Jews in Susa. She requested fasting, not a fast of fashion, but of need. 3 days, she wrote, no food, no drink, no perfume. A fast of stripping away the noise. The city held its breath. The fast spread like a hush over homes and tents. Women pressed their hands to the collar of a robe. Men folded their scrolls like letters to God. They had no power but prayer. They had no army but conviction. There is bravery that looks like silence in 100 mouths, and bravery that smells like incense in the hands of those who cannot fight but can bow. Esther sat alone in the inner chamber for those 3 days and nights. She did not gather her courage as if it were a weapon. She gathered it as one tends a lamp. She fed it with prayers, with the memory of a city whose stones had been broken, with the faces of children whose names might be forgotten by the morning news. At the end of the 3rd day, her face was not the same face that had walked the palace halls when the king's laughter tasted of power. She had been tempered like metal. She had been made luminous by the weight of what she might lose. Yet there was no manual for what came next, no teacher who could tell a woman how to walk into a king's presence unsummoned. The rule was iron. One marched to the king's couch only when invited. To enter uninvited was to step into a field where death and favor stood like 2 sentries, and one might fall by either. Mordecai's last words to her were simple, and they were the hardest. If you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Esther read the sentence over and over, as if it were a map with a single line. The words, "for such a time as this," became a bell inside her chest, an alarm and a summons. The palace had never felt so cold. Even with gold-lined walls, burning torches, and courtyards blooming with exotic flowers, there was a chill that settled deep in Esther's bones as she stood before the closed door of the throne room. Behind that door sat King Xerxes, the most powerful man in the empire, and beyond him, the decision that could either save her people or end her life. The words of Mordecai echoed in her mind like a whisper that refused to fade. If you remain silent at this time, deliverance will arise from another place, but you and your father's house will perish.
And who knows if you were not brought to the kingdom for such a time as this? Such a time as this. Esther's trembling fingers brushed against the fabric of her royal gown, soft white linen threaded with gold. Beneath it, her heart pounded, faster than the drums used in the king's processions. It had been 3 days since she had eaten or drunk anything.
3 days of fasting, praying, and watching the horizon for courage. Her maidens had joined her, their whispers of prayer filling the silence of the night. And when dawn finally came, Esther rose from the cold marble floor, her voice steady as she said the words that would seal her fate. "I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish." The massive double doors opened with a groan, revealing the grand throne hall. Sunlight streamed through towering windows, glinting off the golden pillars that stretched toward the ceiling like fingers of light. The scent of incense filled the air, sharp, heavy, intoxicating. Rows of guards lined both sides of the hall, spears gleaming. And at the far end, seated on a high marble throne, was King Xerxes. His robe was crimson and edged in silver, his crown catching the light as he leaned slightly forward, a lion in human form, watching every movement with quiet suspicion. Around him nobles murmured, their eyes narrowing as they saw Esther step across the threshold. No one entered uninvited, not even the queen. Every step she took echoed through the vast chamber, each sound a heartbeat closer to life or death. Xerxes' face was unreadable, his gaze fixed on her, not with warmth, but curiosity. The royal scepter lay across his lap, untouched. If he didn't raise it, she would die before she reached him. The law was absolute. The guards were trained to strike swiftly. Esther's heart raced. The heat of the hall pressed against her skin. Her hands shook, but her eyes stayed steady. 10 steps away. 5 steps. 3. The silence was unbearable. Even the wind outside seemed to hold its breath. And then, the faintest movement. Xerxes raised his scepter. The golden rod gleamed in the sunlight, catching fire in the air as he extended it toward her. Gasps swept through the hall. Esther fell to her knees, the weight of relief nearly breaking her in half. Her hands trembled as she reached out and touched the tip of the scepter, the symbol of mercy. The king's voice broke the silence, deep and measured. "Queen Esther," he said, his tone softer than she expected. "What is it that troubles you? What do you desire? Even if it is half my kingdom, it shall be given to you." Her breath caught. It would have been so easy, so tempting to speak then, to expose Haman's plot, to cry out for her people. But her heart whispered caution. Not yet. Instead, Esther lifted her gaze with quiet grace and said, "If it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come today to a banquet I have prepared." A murmur rippled through the court. A banquet? Now? But Xerxes nodded, intrigued. "Bring Haman," he commanded. "Let us see what the queen has prepared." The banquet hall was smaller, more intimate, lit by soft light and the sweet aroma of wine and roasted lamb. Her hands were steady now, but her heart remained restless beneath her calm exterior. Haman sat opposite her, smiling smugly, unaware that the walls were closing in on him. The king drank deeply, clearly pleased. "Now, Esther, tell me your request. What do you desire? Even half my kingdom is yours." Again, Esther hesitated. She could feel Haman's eyes on her, sharp, probing. Something told her the time wasn't right. So she smiled, calm and deliberate. "If it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come to another banquet tomorrow. Then I will answer the king's question." Haman's pride swelled like a storm.
To be invited twice by the queen herself, it was an honor beyond honor, one he believed he fully deserved. That night he left the palace grinning, his golden cloak billowing behind him. But as he passed the gate, his eyes fell upon Mordecai, the Jew who refused to bow. The grin vanished. Rage surged. He could not rest until that man and all his people were erased. And so, before dawn, Haman ordered a gallows built, 75 feet high.
By morning, Mordecai would hang from it for all of Susa to see. But that same night, the king could not sleep. He tossed and turned in his vast chamber, the night air thick with unease. Finally, he called for the royal chronicles to be read aloud, old records meant to dull the mind. As the servant read, his voice droned through the candlelight, until the king sat up sharply. "Wait, read that again." The record told of how Mordecai once uncovered a plot to assassinate the king, a plot Xerxes had long forgotten. The king frowned. "What honor or reward was given to this man for saving my life?" "None, my lord," the servant replied. Xerxes stood, his robe whispering against the floor. "Summon whoever is in the court right now." The servant opened the door, and there stood Haman, eager to ask permission to execute Mordecai. "Ah, Haman," the king called. "Tell me, what should be done for the man whom the king delights to honor?" Haman's pride flared again. Surely the king spoke of him. He smiled and said, "Let a royal robe be brought, one the king himself has worn, and a horse the king has ridden with a royal crown upon its head. Let one of the king's nobles lead this man through the city streets, proclaiming, 'This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor.'" The king nodded slowly. "Excellent. Go at once. Do all this for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the gate." Haman froze. The blood drained from his face. But he could not refuse. And so, hours later, Haman, the man who built a gallows for Mordecai, found himself leading his enemy through the streets, shouting praise he could barely choke out. The people watched in stunned silence. Some laughed quietly. By the time Haman returned home, his head hung low. His wife and advisors looked at him with dread. "If Mordecai is of Jewish descent, you will surely fall before him," they said. The next day arrived like a storm waiting to break. The king and Haman returned to Esther's second banquet. The air was tense, heavy with unspoken truths. As they dined, the king once again turned to her. "Queen Esther, what is your petition? It shall be granted to you, even to half the kingdom." This time, Esther did not hesitate. Her heart beat steady, her voice calm but burning with hidden fire. "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, spare my life and the lives of my people. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated." The king's face hardened. "Who is he? Where is the man who would dare to do this?" Esther turned her gaze toward Haman. "The adversary and enemy is this wicked man, Haman." The words hit like thunder. Haman's face went pale. The king's fury erupted like wildfire. He rose from the table and stormed into the garden, his fists clenched. Haman fell to his knees before Esther, trembling, begging for his life. "Please, my queen, have mercy. I didn't know." But even as he spoke, his desperation drove him too close. He stumbled, falling onto the couch where Esther sat, just as the king re-entered. The sight made Xerxes' rage boil over. "Will he even assault the queen while I am in the house?" he roared. Guards rushed forward. A voice from the corner spoke, one of the eunuchs who served the king. "My lord, a gallows stands at Haman's house, 75 feet high, built for Mordecai, who saved the king's life." Xerxes' eyes blazed.
"Hang him on it." And before the sun set, Haman's body swung from the very gallows he had built for another. Days later, the royal decree went out, a new command written in the king's name, sealed with his ring, granting the Jews the right to defend themselves. When the appointed day came, their enemies were defeated. Across the empire, the people of God were saved, not by armies, not by swords, but by the courage of one woman who dared to stand in silence until the right moment to speak. And from that day on, the Feast of Purim was celebrated, not as a story of chance, but of purpose. Because Esther wasn't supposed to be chosen. She wasn't born for power. She was chosen for courage. And her courage changed history.